The wind was a physical fist against the fragile wall of the ruined shed. Alara pressed herself into the corner, dust and splinters clinging to her damp cloak. Outside, the late autumn storm howled, a symphony of tearing wood and shrieking gusts that clawed at the structure's integrity. Rain lashed down with a fury that felt personal, each drop a cold, hard judgment. She hadn't been able to outrun it, her wagon axle snapping miles back, her meager belongings scattered or ruined. Worse than the storm was the knowledge of what and who she was running from. The cold pronouncements, the averted gazes, the swift, merciless cutting off of all she had known. Now, just the elements and the gnawing emptiness in her gut remained. Fear tasted like grit on her tongue. It had been days since she'd seen a friendly face, weeks since she'd heard a kind word. The isolation was a physical ache, sharp and constant. She pulled the threadbare cloak tighter, though it offered little warmth. The light was failing, swallowed by the bruised, heavy sky. Soon the cold would seep deeper, and then, she didn't want to think about, then. A sound cut through the storm's roar. Not the wind, but something heavier, more deliberate. Footsteps, heavy boots crunching on the sodden ground outside. Her breath hitched. Had they followed her? Found her? Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound stopped near the shed entrance. A long moment of silence stretched, broken only by the relentless storm. Then, a shadow fell across the splintered doorway. A man, tall, silhouetted against the gray, his face obscured by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a still, imposing figure in the maelstrom. Alara couldn't move. Her throat was tight, her limbs frozen by terror. Was this it? The end of her desperate flight? He shifted, a slow, deliberate movement. She saw a glint of something in his hand, not a weapon, not obviously. He stepped fully into the shed, bringing with him the smell of damp wool and wet earth. The air around him felt different, charged with a quiet, untamed energy. He didn't look directly at her, his gaze sweeping the meager space. Then he knelt by the broken threshold, not towards her, but facing outwards, towards the worst of the wind. He produced a hammer and some lengths of scavenged which she hadn't noticed. The rhythmic thud of the hammer began, slow and steady, against the storm's chaos. He was boarding up the entrance, not against her but for the shed against the elements. She watched him, bewildered. He worked with a quiet competence, his movements economical and strong. The storm raged, but his presence, his focused task, seemed to push back against the overwhelming sense of despair. When he finished, the wind's shriek was muffled, though the rain still drummed fiercely on the roof. He rose, turning slightly. His eyes, in the gloom, were dark, unreadable. He still didn't speak. He moved to the center of the shed, produced flint and tinder, and with practiced ease, coaxed a small fire to life in a makeshift pit. The flames danced, casting flickering light on his face, revealing a jaw set hard, eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He was weathered, rough-hewn, an outsider like the storm itself, but unlike the storm, he offered something she desperately needed: shelter. The fire crackled, a small, defiant heart in the cold, damp space. Alara watched the stranger from her corner, her initial terror slowly giving way to a cautious observation. He sat on the opposite side of the fire, silent, unmoving, except to occasionally add a small piece of wood to the flames. He offered no conversation, no questions. He didn't even look her way for long stretches. This silence was unnerving, yet it also lacked the aggressive intent she had braced herself for. He was simply present. He wasn't a rescuer with kind words and reassuring gestures. He was merely a force that had intersected with her path, blocking the storm's path to her. Her mind, no longer consumed by immediate flight or the storm's fury, began to turn inward, rehashing the events that had brought her to this desolate place. The whispers, the accusations, the way her neighbors had looked at her after Thomas died, as if his illness, and then his passing, had been a contagion she carried. Being alone was preferable to the weight of their judgment, their suspicion. But alone in the wilderness, exposed to the elements, was a different kind of terrifying. This man, this silent stranger, was a reprieve, albeit one she didn't understand and couldn't yet trust. She studied him covertly. His hands were large, calloused, capable. They moved with a quiet efficiency when he tended the fire. His posture was relaxed, yet alert. He seemed perfectly at home in this rough environment, a part of the wild rather than a visitor to it. She, on the other hand, felt utterly alien, a creature of soft edges and frail defenses exposed to a world that had none. Hunger was a dull ache in her belly, but the thought of asking him for anything felt impossible. He hadn't offered, and his silence felt like a boundary. The firelight danced on his face, highlighting sharp cheekbones and a stern mouth. He had the look of a man who had lived rough, who expected little and gave less, not out of cruelty, but out of a deep-seated caution. He was an enigma, a dark shape against the flickering light, offering safety through sheer, passive presence. She drifted into a restless sleep, the fire's warmth a small comfort against the lingering cold. When she woke, the storm had lessened to a steady rain. The man was still there, seated in the same spot. He hadn't moved, it seemed, except to keep the fire going. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. There was no expression she could decipher, only a steady, unwavering gaze. He rose then, moving stiffly, and walked to the boarded-up entrance. With the same quiet efficiency, he unfastened a section, letting in the gray light of dawn and the smell of wet earth and pine. He stepped outside, disappearing from her sight. Alara sat up, her body stiff and aching. Was he leaving? Had he simply waited out the storm? She didn't know whether to feel relief or a fresh wave of panic at being alone again. But he returned a few minutes later, carrying a handful of wet wood and, to her astonishment, a small, caught rabbit. He didn't look at her as he set about skinning it with a sharp knife. It was a practical act, born of necessity, not charity. Yet, in that moment, watching his focused movements, Alara felt the first tentative shift within her. He hadn't asked for anything, hadn't judged her, hadn't threatened her. He had simply provided. And in his quiet, capable presence, the suffocating weight of her loneliness felt, for the first time since she had fled, marginally less heavy. Days blurred into a strange, shared existence in the shed. The rain eventually stopped, but the outside world remained unwelcoming, shrouded in mist and the chill of late autumn. The man, she learned his name was Silas, spoken with a gravelly softness when she finally, haltingly, asked it, continued his routine. He hunted small game, gathered wood, mended what little he had. He still spoke sparingly, his words pragmatic and brief. Fire needs wood, water's shallow yonder, rain comin'. He didn't ask about her past, her name, why she was alone. And for that she was profoundly grateful. His lack of curiosity felt like a mercy. In this shared silence, a tentative connection began to form, built not on words, but on shared needs and quiet observation. Alara found her own strength slowly returning. She couldn't hunt like him, but she could clean the meager catches, mend her torn cloak with thread pulled from a loose hem, gather dry grass for bedding. She started to move with less hesitation, her fear of him replaced by a quiet respect for his capability and a dawning understanding of his nature. He wasn't a threat. He was a survivor, living on the fringes by choice or circumstance, much like she now was. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she saw him watching her, his dark eyes thoughtful. It was the longest he had held her gaze. He didn't say anything, but the look wasn't one of judgment or suspicion, but something quieter, maybe a flicker of shared weariness. In that moment, the last vestiges of her fear dissipated. This man, who had saved her from the storm, offered no easy comfort, but he offered something more substantial. A quiet acceptance of her presence, and in his actions, a silent promise of protection against the harshness of their shared reality. She felt a resilience she hadn't known she possessed begin to stir within her. The woman who had fled in panic was slowly being replaced by someone tougher, someone shaped by hardship, but not broken by it. She found herself watching Silas more closely too, noticing the way his eyes scanned the horizon, the quiet tension in his shoulders even when resting. He was always alert, always prepared. It spoke of a past as complicated as her own, a history that kept him wary of the settled world. His presence was a bulwark, and standing next to it, she felt stronger. But the world they had escaped still existed. One cold, clear morning, as Silas returned from checking snares, he stopped short. Alara followed his gaze. In the distance, figures on horseback were moving across the landscape, heading in their general direction. They rode with a purpose that sent a cold dread through Alara. It was them, or representatives of them. The people from the town she had fled, coming to reclaim her or worse, to deliver their final, damning judgment. Her fragile composure shattered. Fear, sharp and immediate, seized her again. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with panic. He remained still, his face unreadable, but his body tensed. The silent understanding between them, the quiet peace they had found, was about to be shattered. She couldn't go back. She wouldn't. Not to their accusations, their coldness. Her hand instinctively went to her throat, where a locket, the only thing she had kept from her past life, lay hidden beneath her cloak. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The choice was clear. Face the world that had cast her out, or stand here, beside this silent stranger, and face whatever came. The horsemen grew closer, dark shapes against the pale, frosty ground. 3 of them, riding with the grim determination of those on an unpleasant errand. Alara felt a tremor run through her, a return of the paralyzing fear that had driven her into the storm. Silas moved then, not towards her, but positioning himself slightly in front of the shed entrance, between her and the approaching figures. He didn't draw a weapon, didn't shout a challenge. He simply stood there, a still, formidable presence rooted to the earth. It was a silent defiance, a clear indication that this place, and by extension the person within it, was under his watch. Alara watched him, a strange mix of fear and a burgeoning strength filling her. She was no longer the helpless woman hiding in the corner of a ruined shed. The days of surviving beside this silent man had changed her. She wasn't strong enough to fight them, not physically, but she could stand. She moved from the shadows, stepping to stand just behind Silas, her presence visible, a quiet statement of solidarity. The lead rider reined in his horse a few yards away. He was a man she knew, the town's constable, his face set in a disapproving frown. The other 2 were townsmen, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and stern judgment. "Alara," the constable called out, his voice carrying across the crisp air. "We've come for you. It's time you returned." His tone was heavy with authority, an unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Alara didn't speak. She met his gaze, not with the tearful pleading they likely expected, but with a quiet, resolute stare. Silas remained silent, his gaze fixed on the constable. It was a potent silence, heavier than any words. The constable shifted in his saddle, clearly unsettled by Silas's unwavering stillness. "Who is this man?" he demanded, directing the question at Alara, then quickly back at Silas. "He harboring you? Do you know what folks are saying? About what you might have brought with you?" The implication hung thick and ugly in the air. Alara felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp. They still blamed her, still saw her as a source of contamination, of misfortune. But before she could speak, Silas's voice cut through the tension. It was low, rough, but carried an undeniable weight. "She's with me," he said. His words were not a claim of possession, but a simple statement of fact, a declaration of shared space and protection. There was no arrogance, no aggression, only a quiet, unwavering certainty that brooked no argument. The constable sputtered, and used to having his authority so calmly deflected by a man he likely deemed a drifter or a reclusive ne'er-do-well. "With you?" he scoffed, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes as he looked at Silas's unyielding posture. You can't just claim folks. There are laws. Silas took a single, slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the constables. It wasn't a threatening step, but it radiated a quiet power, the power of a man perfectly comfortable on this ground, answerable to no one but himself. Laws? Silas repeated, the word flat and without deference. And the wild, he gestured subtly at the rugged landscape around them. This is her law now. And mine, his meaning was clear. They were outside the town's jurisdiction, outside its judgments. The constable hesitated. He had numbers, but Silas had the bearing of a man who was entirely prepared to defend his ground, not with bluster, but with grim capability. The townsmen behind him looked uneasy. They had come to retrieve a vulnerable woman, not to confront a man who looked as much a part of the unforgiving landscape as the rocks and pines. After a long, tense moment, the constable's resolve seemed to drain away. He couldn't force the issue without risking a confrontation he wasn't prepared for. Not against this silent, unyielding figure. This isn't over, Elara, he said, his voice lacking its former certainty. Folks won't forget. He turned his horse, motioning for the others to follow. They retreated as deliberately as they had arrived, their departure feeling less like a strategic withdrawal and more like a reluctant acceptance of defeat. Elara watched them go, a shaky breath escaping her lips. She looked at Silas, at his back, still facing the retreating figures. He had stood against them, against the world that had cast her out, with nothing but his presence and a few quiet words. He turned then, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a subtle shift in his expression, a softening at the edges. He didn't offer comfort, didn't ask if she was all right. He simply nodded, a small, acknowledging gesture. In that nod, Elara saw not pity or possessiveness, but a recognition of her own strength, her choice to stand beside him. She had faced her past, not alone, but with a partner forged in hardship. They stood together in the quiet clearing. The threat receded but not forgotten. The path ahead was uncertain, still fraught with difficulty and isolation. But for the first time in a long time, Elara didn't feel utterly alone. Resilience wasn't about never falling. It was about finding the strength to stand again, sometimes with the unexpected help of a silent stranger who became an anchor in the storm. Their story hadn't ended in the shed. It had just begun, written in the quiet understanding between two souls who had found refuge and strength in each other's unspoken company.